Repeat after me. Chypré. Chypré.
I still don't know if I'm saying that right.
I've been practicing this word on and off for years. If you've been following fragrances for a period of time, a few months, and definitely after a few years, you will have seen this word. We're going to talk all about the Chypré. And there's a lot to go into, and we're going to leave a lot out because I don't want to make this video take up your entire day. It is a genre of perfumery, a classical genre of fragrances that dates back 100 years or more. It is a French word and it means Cyprus, referring to the Greek island Cyprus, where labdanum is known to come from in high quantity, and we'll get back to labdanum very shortly because it's very important. Now, the first commercial release of the Chypré came from Coty. It was called Chypré de Coty, came out in 1917, although it was not technically the first of its kind ever created in the genre. That dates back maybe even 100 years or more. One example being Pierre-François Lubon's Eau de Chypre, and he created it for a Russian emperor named Alex I. Now, if you know niche perfumery, you've probably heard the name Lubon, as it is a long-standing historic perfume house. Like other classical perfume genres, see my video about fougères here, the formula for this fragrance has drastically evolved over the years. In its most primal form, it was known as something soft, light, powdery, with florals being at the heart of it, but with a slightly resinous sweetness in the base coming from that labdanum, which we referenced earlier. And that labdanum is one of the characteristics of the Chypre formula that really makes it what it is. And for the most part, it remains in modern formulae these days. But by the time Coty created theirs in 1917, the formula had evolved to become dynamic in nature, a fragrance that has a gradual development as it dries, and it has a lot of depth and dimension to it, and kind of opposites working together in some ways. Really quick, let's go over the classic formula for the Chypre. The top, the opening of a Chypre is known to be hesperidic, as they call it, which is dealing with the fruity element of a citrus plant or citrus peel. But more simply, citruses. We might have bergamot. One of the hallmarks of the formula is a floral heart, and they say it's a rule. And it could be any combination of florals, typically jasmine and rose, ylang ylang, maybe iris, maybe even neroli. And the labdanum, as we talked about, is often found in the heart or the base. It really depends on the perfume, and again, it often offers a deep, rich, resinous, woody scent. It can even be a little bit earthy, or maybe even leathery. Now, it is, again, a rule, an indefatigable rule of the Chypre, that there is oak moss in the base and or labdanum. Again, the labdanum can be present in the heart notes. Also, other woods like patchouli and cedar wood and vetiver, those have also become very common as woody components for the base. And again, in a lot of modern renditions, we see musks and animalics being used, things like castoreum and civet. Now, I'll be real with you guys. After all this information I just shared with you, I did a bunch of research today. After reading about it all, I came away with one word: pretentious. While reading, all I could feel was that, man, the French outlook on classical perfumery can come across as quite stuck up. It's not really the what. It's not the fact that there are rules that are followed. I totally get that. With any art form, you do have parameters of some kind that give structure and form to that art and separate it from other mediums and even other forms of that art. Totally get that. But it's the how. It's how it's explained. It's explained with this unnatural sense of importance towards something that is ultimately inconsequential in daily human life. We don't need this, and the way it's spoken about, you can tell there's passion there, but there's a pretentiousness there. Now, if we can look beyond this sentiment at the facts, at the components, then there's a lot of beauty here. And we can appreciate it without feeling like we're inferior or that we're being patronized. Anyway, moving on. As I mentioned before, this genre has evolved a lot over the years. And there's a ton of variations, maybe endless variations on the formula, each one accenting different aspects of it, using atypical ingredients, some of them twisting it all together, leaving things out. I mean, there's a lot of ways that a Chypre can come together these days. And you'll see what I mean as we navigate these 9 fragrances I have, which as usual, I've split up into 3 levels of accessibility, those just starting out, not sure where to begin. I got a few for you to start with. Intrigued, you've already been starting, you've been collecting, you're starting to get bored, you're starting to get an itch, you're starting to become more interested in more interesting things. And then we have the Enthusiast. You've been around, you know all about it. You're looking for new scent experiences and you're not afraid of them. As usual, the collection I'm going to share with you does not encompass the entire history of the Chypré. So there are many holes here. I mean, if you go to Fragrantica, they have at least 1,800 fragrances cataloged within the Chypré family. So give me a break. If your favorite one is not here, again, it's not because I don't like it. It's because probably I have not tried it. Before we begin, I might as well throw out a few noteworthy honorable mentions that I know some of you will still mention in the comments. MDCI Chypré Paleton, Oriza Legrand Chypré Mousse, Serge Luton Chypré Rouge, Anucci Men, Aramis, Devon. Arige Lador has many of them in their catalog, and obviously too many more. One more caveat. In my experience, the Chypré is not necessarily the most accessible genre by nature. There's something a little bit challenging to it. It's that deep, rich dryness that it can offer. The resinous quality maybe is a little different from what people are used to. So it doesn't really easily cater to the amateur nose. So my classifying of the fragrances I'm going to talk about is very much relative to the genre. Not all of these starting fragrances are ones I would consider to be beginner fragrances. So keep that in mind. You will have to have an open mind when you go into this. Let's dive right into it. That's enough talking. Let's start with our starting category. And you already see one of them behind me here. I almost left this as an honorable mention, but I think it is worth mentioning because many of you know this. Pretentious is technically a Chypré. It is known as a fruity one. Pineapple and apple obviously playing a role there. It does have a bit of a floral heart with that jasmine. There's a dry, woody, and mossy base that comes together to create a form of the formula. I think it's a wonderful fragrance. I do think it is objectively a masterpiece, even though it is played out, unfortunately, these days. It is one of those fragrances where it is a victim of its own success. But honestly, this is without a doubt the easiest start I could give if you're looking to get into the genre. However, many of you have probably already tried this and didn't even realize you had already started down checking out the Chypré. So now you know. That is Aventus. Next, let's talk about one that I'm pretty certain you've never heard of. This is coming from a brand called the Zoo NYC from a perfumer named Christophe Laudemiel, who is a very highly acclaimed perfumer. In many other respects, he's done fragrances for some pretty big houses like Tom Ford, Ralph Lauren, and even Abercrombie & Fitch. And he has a fragrance that he calls Everlasting. This was actually signed by him. Everlasting. This is a very interesting take on the formula because it is labdanum heavy. As I mentioned, some variations on the formula have included accenting certain aspects of it way over the other aspects. Labdanum is super heavy. It's almost sticky here. Sticky, sweet, resinous, and rich. Made a little bit damp and earthy by way of Narcissus, which is technically a floral, but doesn't really smell like a floral. It comes off more like a green, mossy element, and it is warmed by amber, and there actually is moss in here, making it a little dry on the skin. Ultimately, it is a pretty simple fragrance. It doesn't change a ton. Everything is kind of put together as an accord. You don't have a lot of diffusion happening in terms of you losing elements all that noticeably, but the way it comes together is a very well congealed, well blended, and uniquely balanced Chypré. So highly recommend checking out the house. I'm calling this a beginner scent, even though technically it is more complex than the amateur nose would be accustomed to. But again, relatively speaking, this is about as easy as it gets, at least with what I have and what I've experienced. So keep that in mind. That is Everlasting from the Zoo. Everything I just said about that applies to this in terms of its accessibility. Relatively speaking, I think it's fairly accessible, but the average nose might be like, what is this? This is called Etruscan Water, and it's from Francesca Bianchi. She makes a lot of Chypré fragrances. Most of them that I've smelled from her are that. They do have that duality of a soft, floral, sensual quality, maybe a little bit of a sweetness, but a deep, rich, dry, mossy foundation. And you have the same thing here, but I would call this an aquatic Chypré. I don't think that's what they call it, technically speaking, but that's my experience. You do get this fresh, musky, salty ambergris kind of dominating the freshness of the scent, along with some slight fruity citruses, but all of that is underscored by dry oak moss that is very present, especially on the skin and especially as it dries. To be honest, it's probably the easiest of all the fragrances from the brand that I've tried. And that is saying a lot because some of them are pretty dark and pretty obscure and kind of hard to wrap your mind around if you're not used to the genre or the house. You could possibly wear it all year round because of the duality that it has. Even in the summertime, this darkness will prevail. That is Etruscan water. Let's move into our Intrigue category. This one comes from Parfum de Nicolai and it's called Patchouli Intense. Now it's quite complex. It goes through a lot of changes as it dries on the skin that are gradual, kind of what we spoke to earlier. Although it's not the typical formula that you would expect from the Chypré. There's actually no labdanum and no moss in this fragrance. Nonetheless, the profile comes together to represent the formula in a different way. It is quite aromatic with lavender, with geranium, a pretty pervasive freshness, but that's underscored by a heavy woody patchouli note, not terribly earthy or damp, but very woody. And that's balanced by some soft florals and this creamy ambery warmth. It almost kind of represents a fougere as well, but it's not quite that. The depth here, the dimension here definitely represents a Chypré, if you're asking me. That is Patchouli Intense. Also, this stuff is incredibly powerful, so you don't need much of it. Super strong. Up next is one that seems to be a little hard to find for some, but if you can get a sample, please do. This is one I've talked about many times. Timbuktu from L'Artisan Parfumeur. This is technically a woody Chypré. Also, no moss or labdanum in this fragrance, but you have other elements that kind of almost substitute for them and give you the feeling you would expect, but in a different way. We have myrrh instead of labdanum. The myrrh is also kind of a sweet resin, definitely nowhere near as sticky as labdanum or cistus can be. And the papyrus here, which is kind of a dry, woody nuance in here, kind of replaces the moss. And there's a lot more going on here. Incense, mango. It's such a unique profile. It's hard to describe, but it comes together as the most cohesive accord ever. It is beautiful perfumery and a very unique take on the genre. Do check out L'Artisan Parfumeur Timbuktu if you can. It's not going to look like this. This is an older bottle style, so don't be alarmed. The final one for our Intrigued level is technically not a Chypré. You're not going to see that word associated with it online, but it does kind of behave like one, and it does have components that make it look like one on paper until you look closer. This is Mousse Illuminée from Rogue Perfumery. This one has a lot of buzz. If you've never tried this brand, this is a good one to start with. To put it simply, on my skin, what makes it feel like a Chypré is this blend of the damp earth, dry woods, a freshness, soft florals that are very, very light in the heart, and musk. Those things coming together gives me that dimension that I get from a Chypré, but it's very green. I might call it a green Chypré. Imagine you're walking through a forest, you smell the damp floor, you smell the moss and the woods. There's a freshness to the air. That's kind of what you're getting here, but very, very green, along the lines of something like the original Polo for Men, but way more complex, perhaps more realistic in a way, more natural, definitely. That is Mousse Illuminée from Rogue Perfumery. Okay, for our enthusiast tier, I have two fragrances from one brand, which I normally wouldn't do, but I was kind of running low on fragrances in my collection that I felt were worthy for this video. And Roger Parfum is known for his Chypré fragrances. It seems to be one of his favorite genres to work within, and he's made many of them. So I chose two of probably the most challenging ones that I have in my collection. The first one up is the most challenging, and this is called Fetish. I just talked about this fragrance with my wife Grace in an entire Raja themed video we did recently, and I would every time. I would call this an animalic Chypré. Lots of leather, lots of castoreum. Very dry, very pungent almost funky in a way, but when you let it live on the skin, there's some other nuances in here that you're not going to really get up close. They'll be shrouded, they'll be drowned out if you smell them up close, but you get a little bit of florals like jasmine. You even get a little bit of fig, this slightly sweet fruitiness that is like floating around in the smoke. It's a beautiful fragrance. It's very authoritative. It's very commanding and confident. Please sample this first. Do not blind buy this. Please do not blind buy this fragrance. Chances are if you spray it on your hand and you smell it up close and you breathe it like oxygen, you're gonna hate it. I would almost bet money on it. Let it breathe, let it come to you, see what you think. And it might take a few wears to get to know it a little bit better. That is Fetish from Raja Parfum. And the second one from Raja Parfum is definitely not as challenging, but still not easy. This is Diaghilev. This is a gorgeous fragrance and it's a beautiful duality. It is technically a fruity sheep. There is a fruity floral heart to this. Rather than just florals, you have peach. The ylang ylang behaves a little bit fruity as well. This is nowhere near as pungent and dry as Fetish. This is a little bit more airy, but still quite deep and rich. Still a bit animalic, leathery, woody, mossy, a lot going on in here. Very, very complex, but comes together so luxurious. It's very expensive and it smells that way. I don't think it's worth blind buying. Even though it smells very luxurious, it smells expensive, but please sample it first. A great representation and variation on the genre. And our final fragrance, and the final one of the Enthusiast category, is coming from Sarah Baker, and it's literally a sheep in disguise, and it's in the name as well. Charade. It is intense. It's intensely sweet and floral, much more so than you might expect from the typical formula. The florals are really forward. You get a lot of heady white tuberose in this fragrance, and it's made almost honeyed sweet. But when you do let it sit on the skin, you get moss, you get lots of patchouli, and the ylang ylang I think is contributing to that kind of sweet, rich fruitiness, along with maybe some resins. Extremely unique. Sample it first, and once again, do not spray it on your hand and smell it up close. It's a bit much, but I love the way it dries on the skin. I think there's vetiver in here that comes out as this dry woodiness with the moss, with everything else that has that beautiful dimension, but in such a unique way. That is Charade from House of Sarah Baker. All right, so that was a lot. My camera ran out of memory halfway through, which you guys probably didn't even notice, but we filmed a lot of footage here, so I'm gonna have a lot to edit. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think down below. Let me know if you have experience with the genre. Let me know if you've tried any of these fragrances and what your thoughts are. And if you have interest in trying them, there will be links down in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in. Peace. I'll see you in the next one.